Okay, so welcome everybody who's here, internal and external alike. My name's Christopher Van Relt. I'm the head of CEMP, which is the Centre for Excellence in Media Practice research group at Bournemouth University. And this is the last webinar of our series for this academic year. And we have invited back Tamsyn Dent, who was once one of us. And is now at King's College London doing all sorts of exciting things, particularly on work in the creative industries, and is going to talk to us about some of that work and the very important report which she and colleagues recently published and launched at the House of Commons, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Tamsyn, off you go then.
Thanks, Krista. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. And as Krista mentioned, I did my PhD at Kemp, so I'm always very happy to come back and talk to colleagues and peers there. Can I just check, can everyone see my slides? I've got a nod from Krista, so I think that's fine. So my name's Tamsyn Dent. You can call me Tam. I am a lecturer in cultural work based in the Department for Culture, Media and the Creative Industries at King's College London. My research area looks at employment practices, cultures, structures across the broader creative economy. But linked to that, I have an interest in equitable access to work in the creative industries through educational pathways and routes in for early career workers. And that's how I got to be involved in the Making the Creative Majority report. So today I'm going to talk specifically about this research report that, as Krista mentioned, we launched at the House of Commons in October 2023. We included case studies within the report from Bournemouth, so do have a look if you can at the research. But I'm really actually going to talk more today about the statistical data that we looked at for this research report in terms of who is applying to creative-based courses within higher education and what the data says about their pathways into employment. But what I wanted to do as well is to give a bit of a background to the research collaboration that has brought this work together. So just checking, can you see the next slide with everyone's logos on? Just check. Can you give a nod? Brilliant. Thanks, Krista. I'm never 100% confident with Teams. So this research report was the second output from a project that was commissioned, I would say, by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Creative Diversity, which was an APPG set up by Ed Vaizey, Lord Vaizey, Chi Onwaru in Labour MP. Tracy Braben was initially involved, but then she stepped down when she ran for the mayor in one of the mayor kind of positions, and crossbench peer Baroness Deborah Bull. And when they set the APPG up originally, they were thinking about questions of inclusivity across employment within the creative economy within the UK. As I'm sure many people know, there are lots of issues around the impact of precarious-based labour and a sort of absent accountability system for many jobs in the creative economy, which has created all sorts of issues for marginalised identities, specifically women, people of colour, as well as spatial variance across who works where in the creative economy. So the first output, which is called The Creative Majority, which was published in 2021, was looking at what works for equitable inclusion, retention and progression within the labour market across the creative economy. So we were really looking at industry and sort of best practice policies there. But when we were doing that research, what we realised is that many inequalities in creative labour markets actually take place much earlier on. So they sort of start earlier on in the pathways into employment, which is why this sort of second round was commissioned to think about equitable access, inclusion routes for really the post-16 age group into creative work. But of course, as part of that, we looked at creative higher education. And later on in this talk, I'm going to talk specifically about what I mean by creative higher education and how that worked in terms of the data that we looked at. But just to give a bit of background, this was funded by PEC, the Policy and Evidence Centre, which is set up by Nesta. We got some funding from the Paul Hamlin Foundation. YouTube put some money in. I mean, they very quickly forgot about us. And I think what they wanted us to say is people are getting jobs because they just put sites up on YouTube, and I can categorically say the data did not back that assumption up. But, you know, they did put some funding in and attend some of our roundtables. And then in terms of the sort of academic kind of collaboration, we had academics from University of Manchester, University of the Arts London, King's College London, but actually we had support from academics based in Edinburgh, based in Sheffield. We had quant analysis from postdocs that were based in European universities. So it was a really collaborative experience. And I think that that's an important point to make, because we drew on lots of different skills and expertise. But what I want to talk about now is this What Works framework. Can you see that slide? You might recognize some of the names there. So the What Works framework, if for those that don't know, it really comes from the 1970s, from medical tests and the use of randomized controlled trials within drug trials. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's become very popular with, I'd say, the conservative politicians in this country as a way of attaching a kind of robust evidence-based knowledge system to policy making and service delivery. So the Conservative government launched the What Works framework in 2013, led by the former MP David Lidington, and still, I think, current, hopefully not for long, MP Liz Truss. And really, they were really sort of pushing this sort of evidence-based approach to all aspects of policy making, from social care, from healthcare, and indeed also from education. This is just an image from the report that they launched in 2018, which kind of talks about their method and the systematic review of the evidence-based. And the background of the approach, as I said, comes from the kind of increased use of randomized controlled trials from the 1970s within medicine, as a way of kind of countering the drug trials where you would have like two cohorts, one on a placebo, to kind of have a more systematic way of thinking about what intervention works at what point and what are the results. So that's a very kind of brief overrun of what the What Works approach is and why we've used it. Just to give some of the kind of political context, it was very much something that was driven by the APPG, not by the research group. And it's this kind of way of finding, like, actually what's the tangible intervention that we can measure here. So what intervention was put in place, what positive outcome came from it. It's been criticised, of course, by academics. It's been used traditionally, more recently in education. So thinking about, the impact of standardized testing, new forms of curriculum development, and the former and the late president of the British Educational Research Association, Jeff Whitty, in his address, directly critiqued this approach as a policy tool because of the sort of instrumentalization of knowledge and the kind of tensions it brought to the relationship between academic researchers and policy. And that could be something that maybe we reflect on later, like what is our role as academics, both in relation to the politicians and the policymakers that in some ways either commission this work or we want to get our work out to, but also the different student communities that we are in direct contact with and we're aware of. So I think sometimes we are placed in a slightly problematic position of being in between. And that's something that when we were doing this research as a research team, we talked about and reflected on a lot about the limitations to this method. So I'm giving you that background when I talk about report, just to give you a little bit more of the kind of criticism about the What Works approach. It's linked to this sort of growth of deliverology, this idea that we have to be I guess maybe also linked to the impact agenda, that we have to be finding a way to evidence the impact of our research in a very kind of instrumental way. It creates a hierarchy of research methods. It's quite problematic for academics who are more invested in qualitative methods where context and changes over time have a huge impact. And in this paper by Gurwitz and Cribb, who are, by the way, King's academics, state all these threats can push researchers into the direction of pursuing research questions, using research approaches and forming relationships that are aligned with, reinforce and reproduce the new policy common sense, and thereby create endless tests of academic integrity and routine dilemmas for critical researchers. So I think I just wanted to kind of give that background and the awareness of both what the approach was, its history, but also the criticism of it. Coming back to the research approach that we used for the making the creative majority, though, we did apply this framing, what works, particularly to our systematic review of the literature. But we also looked at the statistical analysis and evidence of undergraduate and just undergraduate participation on creative higher education subjects. So we had three main data sets that we looked at. We looked at UK census data to look at employment in creative and cultural jobs. We bought UCAS data, which was looking at applications, offers and acceptances on creative higher education courses from the year 2022. So that was the 2022 cycle, not the year they started. And then we looked at the HEIs data, Higher Education Statistical Authority analysis of creative higher education graduate outcomes. Now, again, you probably all know this, but this data isn't perfect. It doesn't all match up. So the years of the HEIs analysis was based on the destination, it's called the DELI data, Destination of Higher Education Leavers Survey, which I believe finished in 2016 and moved to a graduate outcomes survey. So the actual HEIs analysis is on graduates from 2016. So that doesn't account for things like the COVID impact and the changes that have been happening then. But it just gives a sense of some demographic trends around graduate outcomes from these courses. And then with our What Works approach, by doing a systematic review of key literature, we had three main areas of these what works kind of impact, in terms of these were areas where we could find some tangible evidence that some sort of intervention had been made and had created a positive impact. And these fall across three areas. One was on the widening participation agenda within creative higher education. The second was on the use of work integrated learning, and this includes work-based learning, work simulations and internships within creative higher education courses. And then we looked a little bit at degree apprenticeships for creative occupations. But what I will say, and again, this comes back to the issues with the approach, is that it's quite sketchy. It's really hard to make any major claims that yes, these things are working and they're creating a positive intervention in terms of not only access to higher education but also pathways into employment. So I'm not going to focus on this area in this talk because you can read the report, and probably I'm sure many people sort of anecdotally would be able to sort of recognise that anyway. What I thought I would do is just give the overview of the key findings and talk a little bit about the actual data that we looked at, because that might be useful to this audience. So just to give you a summary of the key findings, looking at the ONS data, we can say that the creative workforce is still dominated by graduates. Now, these aren't all graduates from specifically creative, cultural, media-based degrees. These could be graduates, from economics or PPE or any kind of subject that work in the creative economy. But it's over 70% that actually have at least an undergraduate degree. So it is a sector with high levels of human capital. Again, I think that's not a huge surprise to people in this audience. Access, though, to creative higher education is highly unequal. And I can show you a little bit more about that in terms of looking at the UCAS data. But it shows inequalities of access across gender, ethnicity and social class. There was also quite a lot of spatial variance. Because of disclosure barriers, we weren't able to go into a sort of deep intersectional dive of the data because there's just so few Black, Afro-Caribbean women applying for some of these courses that the numbers are so low we can't actually publish them. But it was very interesting looking at those patterns. And what we found in our research report, that actually the issues around access to creative education start much earlier than higher education can even mitigate for. They really start from birth. They're linked to kind of broader spatial inequalities. They're linked to the kind of decline of creative-based learning within primary and secondary school, and they're linked to access to creative and cultural opportunities within local economies and local governance. So, you know, again, it's sort of saying that there's a big expectation that higher education mitigate for wider inequalities, but actually there's only so much that higher education can do. Where higher education does have maybe a little bit more leeway is looking at the graduate outcome data. So the HEIs data showed us that there were inequalities of gender, ethnicity, and social class in terms of access to creative employment and pathways into the sector, with the Russell group having the most work to do and having the most negative kind of impacts in terms of who gets jobs where. There's also this kind of broader need to review how need is understood, particularly around things like contextual offers within creative-based courses and how they're understood, but that's part of a wider conversation. So again, we have talked about that in the report. So I'm going to just talk about the UCAS data and the HEIs data specifically and what we looked at. So as I mentioned, we looked at UCAS data based on the 2022 cycle year, only at UK domiciled students. We didn't look at any international student data. So we were looking at the number of applications, the number of offers, and number of acceptances across subject area, the actual institution, socioeconomic group, ethnic group, and gender. We also looked at the differences between state education and private education. So we did look at place of application. Which was very interesting, as I'm sure you can imagine. And then in terms of the Higher Educational Statistics Authority, we looked across two different data sets. So the student records, which is a kind of more descriptive breakdown of who's where. But then, as I said, the destination of leavers from Higher Education Survey, which survey students 6 months after graduation for 2015, 2016, 2016, 2017 cohorts. And we grouped the data into three main subject areas. Again, it's not clicking through. This is all available in our report, where you can actually see how we define these different areas. We use the definition of creative higher education actually comes from my colleague Roberta Communion, who also works at King's. She's a professor of creative economies, but she's done a lot of work around the roles of universities and creative economies in specific geographical areas. And so we're defining creative education courses as those that provide specialist knowledge and degrees that could be considered a pipeline for the creative and cultural industries and a training grounds for the future creative and cultural sector. Of course, acknowledging that not everyone who works across these sectors has a specifically creative higher education degree. And these are the three areas that we categorized the different JACS codes. So we looked at creative arts and design. So this is mainly craft-based codes, but also things like fashion, creative media, which was looking at advertising, film, TV production, but also all the publishing was in creative media. Creative other, which is architecture, computer. Now I don't think that's perfect. We did a lot of time thinking about how do we divide this into three main areas. I think there's still quite a lot of work to do, but I think this whole tension around how do you label and define all the various different codes and courses that are linked to creative higher education is a bigger piece of work. But do have a look at our list in the report if you're interested in thinking about how we broke this up. Again, I'm just going to give you a couple of slides to sort of show the kind of trends. If you look at gender, you can see that women who apply to creative-based courses are much less likely, well, not much less, but are less likely to be given an offer to a course than men. That doesn't necessarily relate to all other subjects, but it does have an impact when you think about creative-based subjects and the broader humanities. But overall, there are much higher numbers of women applying to creative-based degree courses than there are men. But this is the same across all of higher education. There are more women going into higher education than men more broadly, particularly in the arts and humanities and creative subjects, but actually overall. When we look at ethnicity, the numbers are very low. And Black African Caribbean students were more likely to not be given an offer when compared to their white peers across most of the different kind of areas: creative arts and design, creative media, creative other. And then we've also got some SES data. And again, we use the NSEC kind of categorization into sort of 3 different areas. You've got the managerial, the kind of intermediate, and then you've got the routine labour kind of sector. And it's based on parental jobs and income for each student at the age of 14. Again, it's not perfect. Again, anyone who's a statistician knows this, but UCAS actually changed how they define SES, I think in 2020. So that also makes kind of doing longitudinal analysis over different pathways across social economic class quite tricky. But this just gives you a bit of a snapshot. All of the data in the tables from both the UCAS, the HEIs analysis are all available in the report. There were some interesting findings around disability. We found that there are a higher number of students who had some kind of physical or mental health disability applying to creative-based higher education subjects compared more broadly to the humanities, and that was giving more students with a disability opportunities for learning and progression into employment. I've got a slide about that in a minute. So I think what I wanted to kind of talk about in this course and in this seminar was, what can higher education do for creative diversity based on the UCAS and the HEIs data. We can't mitigate for the broader structural inequalities in relation to access to cultural and creative opportunities within local communities, or to think about what's happening within formal primary and secondary education and the sort of reduction of creative subjects, and particularly at GCSE level and A level since the introduction of the EBAC. The Campaign for the Arts has a really interesting they've actually done some really interesting visualizations if you're interested in the reduction of GCSEs in all sorts of subjects like design and technology, music, since the introduction of the EBAC. And I definitely recommend people have a look, because it's quite stark when you just see the drop off of students taking those subjects. But of course, we know that if they don't have access to GCSEs or A levels in creative based subjects, it's unlikely that they're going to go into studying a creative higher education degree. What we found that Black and Asian students are much less likely to undertake a creative higher education subject than their white peers, as are students from medium and lower socioeconomic status. Women are slightly more likely to study creative subjects, but this is driven by a higher percentage of women in disciplines, specific disciplines. For example, there were more women in creative arts and design than there were in creative media and creative other. And then those with a disability, either physical or mental, are more likely to study for a creative degree than humanities more broadly. And there was some positive data around that. The groups least likely to undertake a creative subject were actually male, Pakistani or Bangladeshi students, those who have no disability, and those who are from middle or low SES families. So I think then thinking about this question of access in relation to our findings on widening participation, there's a lot that different HE institutions can be doing in terms of targeted widening participation approaches for those groups who are less likely to undertake creative subjects at the HE level, but also at which point that impact or that intervention should be placed within the school education system. Again, I think there's more work that needs to be done around this, but it's definitely something that higher education institutions could think about in relation to the broader widening participation agenda. When we looked at the graduate pathways into the sector, we found that women, ethnic minority graduates, and those from medium or low SES backgrounds are less likely to go into creative jobs immediately after graduation, because the Delhi survey is 6 months after graduation. Students with disabilities, though, were more likely to work in the creative economy 6 months after graduation than other subjects. Black and Asian graduates are less likely to enter the creative economy than their white peers. Only exception is they enter a non-creative role, and I'm going to talk about this more broadly in the next slide. Socioeconomic differences are smaller in this category. White men with no disabilities are a lot more likely to access creative jobs immediately following graduation than the other groups. And then we also looked at how people got their first job. And what was really interesting was that women and ethnic minorities, if they went into work in the creative economy, were more likely to access that job through their higher education provider or through a direct job advert, whereas white men were more likely to access their first job via personal contacts and networks. And I think that's a really interesting point in terms of how higher education can, and indeed potentially should be, thinking about how they can mitigate through these inequalities, through these sort of direct pathways into industry for their graduates, and through the context they have. So that was an interesting data point that I thought I should flag here. When it comes to actually working in the creative economy, employment outcomes are less favourable, again, for women, ethnically diverse and disabled graduates than their white, non-disabled men. We used the Dent model when we were looking at it. So, creatives that work in the creative economy, creatives that work outside the creative economy, and then non-creatives that work in the creative economy. And that we found that female creative higher education graduates are more likely to be employed as embedded creatives. So that means they are using their creative skills in other sectors. So that could be working in PR or marketing in health or social care, etc., etc. Medium and low SES graduates are also less likely to work as a specialist creative than higher SES graduates. If they get a job, our Black and Asian students were more likely to work in the creative industries, in the creative occupation, than their white peers. But again, that has to be understood as very few actually do get a job. So the ones that do are therefore more likely to have a kind of direct creative based job, and then you bring them potentially questions of either tokenism or this sort of, just a few people making it, and then that's sort of meant to be a trend, whereas actually we just want more people accessing the sector more broadly. And then those with physical and learning disabilities are more likely to work in creative industries than their non-disabled peers, but again more likely to be embedded in non-creative roles within the creative economy. I'm really rattling through, but like I said, it is more detailed in the report. As part of our outputs, and I'm just checking myself for time, because I think I've been talking for 25 minutes and I want to allow some time for questions and also comments and feedback. Yeah, I think I've got a few more minutes. We did have some key recommendations for higher education, again, based on the What Works findings across these areas of widening participation and work integrated learning. And I'm writing up an article on the work integrated learning section at the moment, actually, because I think that there's some really useful, interesting interventions. But I think for widening participation, although it can be useful in terms of getting students into higher education, more needs to be done around the belonging agenda and pathways into employment. We talked about the need for a kind of multi-stakeholder review of the widening participation indicators and guidance, and going back to this question of contextual offers and financial support, which I know that some of the political parties are talking about bringing back student maintenance grants and things like that. But I think, yeah, that definitely the cost of living, the kind of discourse around, low value degrees, Mickey Mouse degrees, is potentially putting a lot of students off anyway. But actually, as I said, the intervention around helping people to access creative-based courses needs to happen at a much earlier age. There's some really interesting data as well about care experience students and estranged students as well in creative subject courses that we've looked at in the report as well. We thought about as well replicating some form of Athena Swan Charter for widening participation. So widening participation in the UK HE, even though it's part, the access plans are part of the kind of fee deal, they're still very ad hoc. So institutions are kind of delivering their widening participation agenda in very different ways, which is, I think, fine, and particularly given that there will be different issues around widening participation in different subject areas, but we felt that there needed to be more sharing of knowledge and skills across the sector to sort of think about targeted widening participation to specific courses and more evidence-based widening participation. We also, as I said, looked at this question of work integrated learning. Again, it's quite patchy because there's just not that much evidence around it. We found that for higher education staff who aren't necessarily valued through the system for implementing good work in integrated learning internship programs need increased support, that it needs to be more recognised in things like career progression, that it needed to have more funding, more time, more opportunity for evaluation, safeguarding, etc., and then kind of a better kind of monitoring system of graduate outcomes following different work integrated learning models. We found positive interventions from other subject areas. Actually, there was more research from things like engineering pathways, medicine pathways, health and social care pathways into employment through widening through work integrated learning, than necessarily within creative courses, even when you account for creative courses like architecture, where work integrated learning or work-based learning is a key part of the curriculum. So there's definitely things to be learned from that. So I wanted to end with this question of what next for creative diversity. So following this research report, the APPG has sort of been on a permanent pause, partly because of the election and partly because we're in this sort of space of not knowing what's really going to happen in terms of education and the lack of kind of political interest in education, particularly higher education, has been quite interesting as I've been sort of going in a bit of a dive across the various different party manifestos. It doesn't seem to be high up on the agenda, even though we know that there are real threats to higher education more broadly, just through the cost of living question, the fee issue, and also this question of international students and migration. But I think when we were looking at our evidence, what we found is there's actually a critical lack of evidence. So people, probably because same with our previous research report, just don't have the time, the funding or the support to do proper evaluation models. So we don't really have much evidence of what works. Which is why I've gone back to the data. We can look at, who's going in, when, how, why, and who's missing. But actually, we need to match some of that knowledge up with the different interventions that are put in place. I think there's also a lack of take-up engagement with this What Works framework. I mean, I wouldn't blame people for not wanting to take it up, but I think there's still, when we were sort of asking people for evidence, there's still much more discussion around the issues, not around the kind of positive interventions, probably also through the lack of data. When it comes to education, actually many of the issues around access, as I've said, start well before application to higher education courses. So we need to have a more holistic approach to understanding creative education, really from cradle to grave. And then I think there's also this question of the continued relationship between academics and policymakers, something you reflected on at the beginning, Krista, that we're often charged to do this research. We do the research and present it, but actually we don't really necessarily have the power within either the industry or within policy to actually move recommendations to change. So there's a question of where we sit and who takes responsibility. So I'm going to finish there. Hopefully that's given you some insight into the research that we've done. And I really do hope you have a look through the research and the data, and really do welcome your thoughts, your feedback, and your knowledge on this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamsyn. If people have questions, you can put your hand up or you can say something in the chat. I wanted to ask you while people are just thinking about that, Tamsyn, and you might have answered this before, and I might not have been paying attention probably. A lot of what you're describing about access and unequal access and blah blah, and also unequal support and so forth through higher education. We'll all know as practitioners that applies across the board. Is there a compelling difference in the stats when you just look at those creative courses than when you're looking at HE generally?
Yeah, it's really hard to go to that level. You're always just looking at kind of like trends in the data. I think, as I said, I guess it's interesting to talk about what surprised us. So a lot of the statistical things, you're like, yeah, okay, we knew that. Like we knew that there are more women applying to these courses, but less likely to get kind of particular sort of specialist creative jobs, that there's big ethnicity problem. Broadly, there's spatial variance, which I haven't talked about, but that also is there. But I think when we were looking at disability, that was really interesting. And I think there is, again, we would need to do more, I think, qualitative research, but there is obviously a space here for students with various different disabilities where they can learn in creative-based subjects in a way that they potentially can't in kind of maybe more formal humanities-based subjects. So there is opportunity there, which I think could be developed and reflected on further, and particularly, I mean, I don't know about you, but this sort of challenge constantly where you feel like you're having to make your case for the worth of your subject. In this instrumentalist Leo data, people don't enough, that actually you're saying, well, that there's actually a lot of value in enabling a diversity of access to these subject areas, and therefore we need to be really thinking about how we broaden out that widening participation agenda. But I couldn't see a sort of direct trend through the data because, as you've seen, it's quite patchy. The different data we're looking at, it was really hard to kind of make sort of like anything beyond descriptive claims. That answer your question?
Yes, probably. I think it's difficult because you're talking specifically about creative subjects, and then obviously all these other subjects, and so it's hard to know what's specific to us. Penelope, you had a question.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I've got my camera on, so I don't know if you can see me. I've been having problems with it. So do you think it's, I'm quite an elderly student, shall we say. I'm a musician, made a couple of albums, all that sort of thing, had a radio show, wrote it, all that sort of thing. Do you think it's unrealistic do you think it's almost unethical to suggest to students that being creative can have any positive outcome, when really what happens is it's been my experience and those of colleagues that the only thing that happens to creativity is that it's exploited.
Are you talking about any positive outcome in terms of studying a creative subject or working in the creative economy as a creative?
Yeah, I think I think one of your slides said that for example, most women that are creative end up working in non-creative roles, in the sense that they're managing other people. So there is a sort of funneling. Creativity tends to get channeled in to the point where people in offices are exploiting it, and on high salaries.
Yeah.
And the actual creative artists. So is it sort of unethical to encourage students of any background or cross-sectional background to be creative when they might perhaps best spend their time learning how to work Excel or the Microsoft Office, or touch up on I mean, because the outcome really at the end of the day is that creativity is not rewarded, but the people who manage it are. So, what's your views on that?
I think that's quite. I think I wouldn't want to say that it's not rewarded at all. I mean, I think in the context of paying fees and education, there are all sorts of problems which are beyond working in the creative economy that aren't just related to creative and cultural students. And as I said, there are a lot of issues around inequalities in the creative and cultural industries linked to the structures of employment and precarious labour. That said, there are women that earn money in the creative economy. You know, it's not like completely that nobody does and it's not valued. The question of like, is it morally, ethically right to encourage people learn creativity? I don't think I could answer that. What I would say is that there is also flip side that looks at, yeah, actually creative cultural workers are very entrepreneurial. They do study Excel and things like that, and coding and resources on their courses. And I think that what I would say about doing a creative based subject is you do learn a lot of transferable skills. I guess the question is more broadly like, what's a degree for and what's an education for? Is it just for employment or is it for learning? And I think that's a broader question, and we've probably all been asking for a very long time. But definitely the way that this government, and I would say probably the previous government, has set things up is that the only point of doing a degree is to get a job, whereas educators would probably argue that yes, that's obviously very important, and we know that graduates do earn more money kind of broadly than non-graduates, but actually the other point is to learn and to develop and think, and I think it'd be really problematic if we sort of said, oh, there's no point in learning or thinking because you won't get paid much.
Yeah, certainly. It's almost going back to Nietzsche, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's really interesting. It is quite sad that university, humanities courses are being slashed right, left, and centre, because of course it's the only area within the creative arts that government can be critiqued. So if you take away the humanities from universities, there isn't any space where government can be critiqued, which is rather frightening, isn't it? But yes, thank you. I enjoyed the talk immensely, and I have full confidence in Bournemouth Uni and the PhD that I'm doing in humanities. So I did enjoy the talk on an academic level as well. I'll let someone else have a go now.
Are there other questions? Anybody else got a question to field? I'll field one while you're thinking about it. Did you actually separate out? You talked about whether people went to private school or state school.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know. As far as I'm aware from other studies, there's quite a significant difference in terms of success at getting into roles in creative industries. Is it more significant than doing a creative course at university?
Yeah, I think so. We can actually look through at pretty much every single provider. I mean, we had so much and see exactly which student applied where. So there was a huge amount of data that we looked at, and I think we were also coming up against things like tariff scores, and so it became really tricky to kind of make it into a publishable output. But so there's a lot of research that was done where we were just looking at it, but we're not legally able to kind of present it. And I think that became, we either ran out of time, but I know we were asking about, place of application, and is that kind of significant across these three different areas? I'd have to go back actually and have a look at it. And I know that Heidi Ashton at Warwick has sort of looked very much, for example, at how creativity and culture is more valued financially in the private education system in terms of access to resources and subject area, and in the state it's really kind of been rolled back. But like, for example, we don't have like a chart that says like X number of private school kids got in compared to the others, although we probably could do that, but it just didn't work for this report and what we were doing. It's always down to time, isn't it? Because we had like this intense period of time when we had the quant support people working on this. So it was Mark Thomas from University of Sheffield that was working on this with some postdocs, and I think that it ended up just being too tricky to publish it. But it is definitely worth looking at in more detail, for sure.
I think it's worth knowing because, we work very hard in university, sort of, as you say, level the playing field, and there's some, evidence that we do some of that. but I think it's sort of interesting to put it in that wider context, because sometimes it's almost like we're just sitting in the middle as a sorting hat, and the job is already done. I heard the head of equity rather depressingly at a talk not long ago say that the preponderance of privately educated people in equity was higher now than in 2009.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And not surprising to you or me, I suspect. Can you talk to us a little bit about apprenticeships, Tamsyn? And what's happening with that at the moment, and how successful they're being in the industry?
Not very. Partly because I think that broadly, for those that again, I'm not sure how much people know, but in 2017, under Theresa May, the apprenticeship system was changed, and with the introduction of the apprenticeship levy, actually the NHS is the kind of institution that probably has put more in and got more out of the apprenticeship levy than any other sector. There is very little data on the impact of degree-based apprenticeships. So you've got two different things. You've got apprenticeships that have been running through different crafts and different areas and different subjects, probably for centuries, and then you've got the degree-based apprenticeship sort of model. There's definitely questions around parity of esteem. So when we were looking at the evidence, we found that there was an apprenticeship scheme for solicitors that had been put up, and the assumption or the hypothesis would be that you would get lower and medium SES status applicants, but actually it was all much higher SES status, because when they did some qualitative research to follow up, there's still this sense of like, if I do a degree-based apprenticeship from a kind of lower SES background, there's a stigma attached to it. So I'd rather just get into masses of debt. There's also issues around the way the apprenticeship system is set up, and the problem with like particularly subsectors of the creative economy is that would require groups of employers coming together to sort of set up a kind of course structure in collaboration with a higher education provider. And at the moment, there just doesn't seem to be a kind of mechanism that enables and supports people to do that. That said, when we looked at degree-based apprenticeship models in things like the police force, health, NHS, like I said, it could be positive. It could be a positive intervention. We just haven't done enough of it yet to get any evidence by which we can say, yes, this is a positive intervention. So I think that there is definitely scope for it to be, particularly in certain creative occupations, a really positive intervention. But there's questions around parity of esteem. There's questions of, does it actually make it diverse if the people who it's sort of targeted are feeling that they'd be stigmatized if they do it? There's not enough of them, so there's huge amounts of competition already. And then the impact is still a bit too early for us to sort of see any kind of long-term data. But I'd be really interested to see what happens with apprenticeships, particularly after this election, because it's being talked about a lot. Oh, you're muted, Krista.
Sorry, we've got banging, we've got building going on, so I keep turning it off. Is there any other questions that people would like to ask? I'm aware that a lot of people are on Education Day and probably rushing off to a break. If not, I will wrap it up there. Let Tamsyn go. Thank you so much, Tamsyn, for talking to us about that. Don't forget, people, you can access the report. Don't know if you want to flash that QR code up again. This is the last webinar, as I said, of the CEMP webinar series for this academic year. There will be more next year, and we will publicise them in the normal way as and when we pull them all together. So thanks so much, Tamsyn. And thanks everybody for attending, and I will make a recording available as requested.